The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome. Good afternoon. I am Barb Sorum. I will be your moderator for today's webinar. I work with Minnesota Communities Caring for Children. Today's webinar is Trauma-Informed Approaches in Minnesota Schools. If you have joined the webinar, you just kind of a few details. We're going to save questions, comments, and sharing until the last portion of it. So if you could just hang on to your questions or ideas and thoughts until then. And when we do get to that part, you should see a hand. You can raise your hand. I will unmute you at that time. If you have questions, you can go ahead and type questions in the question box, and we will see those and get to all of the questions as they come in, or really concentrate on them at the end. And you have entered and you are all muted. I will be able to unmute you as we go through the webinar. So right now, I am going to introduce Dr. Mark Sander. He's a senior clinical psychologist for Hennepin County, and he works in the Minneapolis Public Schools, consults with schools across Minnesota and other states. So, Mark? You have to unmute yourself, Mark.
Hey, all right, excellent. So we got the muting figured out. So
yeah.
Thanks everybody for being here today. To start off, we're going to start with a couple of poll questions just to see, one, who's joining us, but also just kind of see kind of what your work has been. So Barb, can you put out the poll questions?
I will, and so we can see your screen as well, right. So if you want to adjust that while I put up the poll. We have a couple poll questions that we're going to ask today, very basic ones, and you should be able to just click one answer. And here's the first one. Which best describes your current role? Good, everybody's marking. Thank you very much. I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close that, and I'm going to share the results so you can see, Mark.
I think I've got to give the screen back to you to see it.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Sorry, but we're working through the technology. we did a couple of practice runs, but we didn't practice the polling. All right, awesome.
Okay, so you can see that. Great. Yep. Okay.
All right,
Do you want to jump into the next one? Okay. So the next one you should be seeing, have you attended an ACE training presentation before today? Okay, and you're already marking, great. I'm going to close that. And I'm going to sharing the results.
Fabulous.
I know, that's great. Thank you. Okay, we've got a couple more. this one.
And again, we're hoping that people will share at the end of the presentation today some of the work that you're doing. So we're just wanting to get a sense of how many people are doing some kind of trauma-informed work in your schools or other organizations.
Okay, I'm going to close that.
Excellent.
And the final question. Mark, you want to talk about this one a little bit before I put it up, or while it's up?
Sure, and this is just today, the way that we've organized this webinar is to try and make it truly interactive and a way to share across the state what people are doing. And I know that sometimes that can be a little clunky to do within the webinar format, so we're going to have some things here so you can either, at the end when the two presentations are done, there'll be a way for you to enter into the chat if you'd like to share something that you're doing, or you can raise your hand, and then our moderators behind the scenes will be able to let you know when they're going to unmute you so you can share. So we'd just like to know how many people would like to briefly share what they're doing today related to the trauma-informed work that they've got going on.
Okay, I'm going to close that and share the results. I think once, also Mark, once they hear some of the presentation, when I hear things that other people are doing, it's like, oh, we're doing that, or we're doing this, does this count? Or, you know, it's, yep. And having more of a conversation toward the end is what we're hoping. Go ahead.
Yep, absolutely. And again, so we hope that you are, you know, so I mean, here's the difference. I think it was like 60% of the people said they were doing some things in their work environment, and only 14 are comfortable sharing. And, you know, hey, this is going to be a safe place to share. I think, you know, we all want to kind of hear what people are doing, hear a little bit about kind of what we're doing that I'm doing in Minneapolis with some other colleagues, but also know that, you know, the next presentation comes from a group up in Bemidji that I went up there about like a year and a half ago, spent like a day and a half with them, and then they're like off to the races doing this awesome work. So I think being able to share the things that we're doing will, I think, just generate more interest and also kind of more comfort about, yeah, wow, I really am doing the right thing. You know, me myself, I've consulted with, you know, Stacy and Sharleen about, well, what have you learned over the past year, and does it match up with what I've learned? I've reached out to colleagues in Wisconsin and Washington State, and the themes are very similar, and of course that makes me feel more comfortable and confident in kind of what we're trying to do. So I'm going to share this, share my webcam, so we're going to get going. So I guess I want to just frame up what this presentation is not going to be. You know, it's not going to be the ACEs 101 or a trauma-informed schools presentation. It's not going to have that same kind of content. It's not going to be that kind of paradigm shifting. So really excited that a lot of people, majority of folks, have already been to a talk like that. What I am going to talk about is really focusing on kind of some of the work that we've done, that I've done and some others have done in Minneapolis over the past several years. Talk a little bit about what we've learned about trying to develop trauma-sensitive schools in a large urban school district, where a lot of the work is decentralized, and that's one of the challenges. And then some future ideas about, you know, how to continue and move this work forward. So I'm only going to have about 20 minutes or so, so I'm going to try and race through things. So this for me has kind of evolved over the last several years in talking with others doing this work across the country, and just in doing this work both here in Minneapolis and in a couple schools in St. Paul. So for me, this is just kind of a tentative framework. You know, step one is really that ACEs 101 trauma-sensitive schools training. I think it's best to do it in about 3 hours. I know that's tough to do in schools, so even if you do like 2 90-minute chunks, I think the content only needs to be about, you know, an hour and 45 minutes, maybe 2 hours, but then we need to have time for folks to kind of reflect on what's going on. Then the next part, after we've kind of got folks to do that paradigm shift, really looking at what are the overarching kind of guiding values for your school related to being more trauma sensitive. I'm going to briefly talk about PBIS, Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, or MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, and how kind of SEL, which is social emotional learning, fits within that, the importance of reflective consultation and conversation, the importance of self-assessment of SEL practices and interventions at each tier, and then close with the importance of self-care. So again, like I was talking about, the exposure and awareness building regarding the impact of adverse childhood experiences is just critically important to really help shift the way adults are thinking about student behavior. And again, for me, a lot of this work is really about the adults and really helping the adults think about student behavior differently, thinking about their systems differently, and just thinking about the work a little bit differently. And then we need to collectively develop trauma-informed beliefs, assumptions, and attitudes collectively. I didn't read my slides, so yeah, so it's, again, obviously got collectively in there twice. Really important that this is a way for the school to come together. Or if you can't get your whole school, maybe just your grade level team. But again, we've got to have this team where students are hearing these repeated messages around your trauma-informed beliefs, assumptions, and attitudes. Ongoing professional development, both in group and individual, for reflection and discussion. Alignment of your current policies, practices, and programs in order to support trauma-sensitive environments at the school and district level. There needs to be a safe environment for staff to practice trauma-informed approaches and get support and coaching without this having performance implications. There's a lot about kind of, you know, teacher performance reviews right now, and I think this needs to be a place where they can be safe to experiment, try things, get support and coaching, and then the availability and encouragement of self-care. So there's kind of, again, 6 key elements. Adults must adaptively change their behaviors, assumptions, and beliefs. Much of what we need to create trauma-sensitive schools already exists, right? We have a lot of what we need already. All school staff need to be involved in the professional development and reflection process. School leaders must create an environment where it's safe for adults to share and reflect. We need to focus on student engagement with positive school-wide plans linked with positive school-wide engagement plans. Now that's something specific to Minneapolis, but again, that's about the alignment. We've got some work going on here where schools have to make positive school-wide engagement plans. This is exactly where this trauma-informed work can live and thrive and help support those plans. And then we need to have high-quality, relevant instruction to engage students, right? So we can't forget that we're about teaching and about instruction and about the need for high-quality content and delivery. All right, so again, sounds like a lot of you have had the ACES 101 training, so I'm just going to hit a couple of key points for me to make sure that we've got these fundamental beliefs, right? The whole school participates in this activity. We emphasize the central nervous system's main job is to help us adapt to stay alive. And then what we repeatedly experience is what gets wired in to our brains, our physiology, and our social perception. And that's a really key point for schools, because that's where the hope lies. Because we can intentionally choose what the repeated experiences we want students to have. And again, that's why it's so important to come up with those collective ideas about what are those repeated experiences? What are the key guiding values of our school? And how do we make sure that we have repeated experiences for students every day throughout the day to experience that and to hear us talking about it and modeling it. Our experiences and the adaptations necessary to survive those experiences get wired into our biology. And misbehavior in one setting, such as school, might be a successful adaptation in another setting or environment. And really what we need to do is help young people develop successful adaptations for schools, right, and help them learn those skills to be successful in schools, and they need to be taught and repeatedly taught and experienced. All right, on to kind of the overarching goals. Again, this is all about those repeated messages, right? So you're already hearing me, right, 3 or 4 slides in, repeating myself, and that's intentional because this is where really a lot of our power lies, in being able to create new pathways for children, new neural networks, kind of new kind of default behaviors in school. It's through these repeated messages and experiences, and these are critical for creating a culture and climate that promotes and nurtures resiliency. And collaboratively, schools need to develop these. So the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and you can go, when you're done today, Google creating trauma-sensitive schools space, capital W, capital I, and get to their website. They've got a lot of great information. But these are the 5 key values that they came up with: safety, empowerment, collaboration, trust, and choice. And so they've used this to really think about, how do we model this? How do we show this in the way that we develop behavior plans for kids? How do we think about how we model safety, create safe classrooms? And you're going to see me showing a little bit of that later in the presentation. Here's another one from the Heart of Teaching and Learning, the Collaborative Schools, the Compassionate Schools monograph. They've got these 6 key principles: always empower, never disempower, provide unconditional positive regard, maintain high academic and behavioral expectations, check your assumptions, observe and ask curious questions, be a relationship coach, and provide guided opportunities for helpful participation. Because a lot of our students, right, they don't feel successful in school, and as they get older, they tend to check out or think school is dumb or that they can't do things. And so we really, as the adults, need to find ways to provide them opportunities to really engage and participate and contribute, because I believe that every student wakes up in the morning wanting to be good at school. Unfortunately, for some of our students, that only lasts for about half a second because they've had so many repeated experiences of failure in school. All right, so now I want to shift about, so now we've kind of talked about these kind of conceptual pieces, these principles, getting that paradigm shift about behavior and how we think about behavior, and that's really important, and that's really great, and that's really going to help kind of fuel the energy. But then we need to really have an organizing framework to think about, how do we help students, right? And so that we're really providing support to all students. And so these are just kind of 2 different visual descriptions of social emotional learning and, well, of multi-tiered systems of support or positive behavior interventions and supports. They're very similar concepts. So here on the left-hand side, you can see down in there at the bottom of the triangle is the universal level. This is everybody. So, right, so this is the stuff that you do universally related to social emotional learning. Maybe you're doing second step across your whole K-5 school, right? And you're teaching those lessons and modeling those lessons every day. That's great. Maybe you're doing responsive classroom. You know, maybe you're doing some other SEL interventions, but we really need to have an expectation that we're doing some work with all students, right? Because for some students, that's all they're going to need to be able to thrive and excel. But if we're not doing that, some of those students where that might have been enough, wind up kind of needing some additional support because they didn't get what they need at that universal level. And then there's some students that even when they get that universal level of support and education and social emotional learning and mental health, they're needing something a little bit more. So that's when we moved up to the targeted level, or tier 2, or the yellow zone. It's called a number of different things. It all really means the same thing, right? And here we're looking at maybe brief interventions, maybe group interventions to really help this student kind of gain the social emotional skill that they need so that after a little while they're not needing that level of support anymore, and really the universal level is sufficient. And then there is a smaller group of 5 to 10% of the students that really need an intensive level of support. And this might be mental health intervention, this might be special education, this might be a lot of things, but this is more intensive, a longer duration, and oftentimes one-on-one. So again, this is kind of just to give you another kind of visual of the tiers and kind of moving between the tiers. Schools should implement social emotional learning and mental health supports that will address the needs of all students. And they should have programs at each of the tiers. And this is one thing that I find when I'm going into buildings, that sometimes they're not having some interventions at all of the tiers. And so then that's okay. So that's just where we need to promote some growth and do a little bit of work to help them either identify some strategies, get buy-in for doing these strategies, to really make sure that we've got all 3 tiers with some social, emotional, and mental health interventions and practices. So again, just to come back, and Wisconsin might be kind of a thread through my presentation today to kind of show you how one state kind of move forward with this. So here's again that tiered framework, and you can see on the right kind of the key areas of academics, cognitive skills, educator capacity, social emotional learning, relationships, and then on the left-hand side, you see how they're saying, okay, so how do we think about safety, empowerment, collaboration, and trust across all of the tiers? So once we've kind of got that tiered model of support in mind, then we really got to think about, okay, so you've got the tiers and you've got the interventions, but who's doing the work? And so this isn't quite a triangle, because here we've got people maybe doing work at tier 1, maybe tier 1.5, tier 2, maybe a couple of people doing work at tier 2. So you see all the way at the left-hand side, teachers, right? Right, they're really, they're doing interventions in the classroom, and this is from a school at Jenny Lind in Minneapolis, right, that's supported by the psych or the social worker. It's reviewed within their multi-tiered systems of support, kind of ongoing implementation meetings, and it can be both academic and behavioral. Then you've got the behavior deans that are doing some push and support within the classroom to help kids practice skills in the classroom, to help them generalize those social emotional skills in the classroom. Then you've got a social worker who's doing some work around bullying, around homeless and highly mobile, partnering with teachers to maybe develop even a little bit more sophisticated intervention plans for the classroom. Got a school psych doing special ed evaluations, consulting with teachers for interventions as well. And then at this school, they've got a specific SCL social worker. So this is someone who is supporting other social workers, but also really leading training related to SCL interventions and curriculum, working with teachers to create ongoing classroom accommodations, doing some individual work with students, maybe not at the level of a therapist in terms of intensity or duration, but maybe more frequently than their traditional school social worker. So again, it's thinking not only about having those tiers there, but who's doing the work and organizing who's doing the work. Next, really talking about, okay, so now we've got the paradigm shift, we've got a system that we're working on. So concurrently, after that first training, we really need to start thinking about how do we have some ongoing reflective consultation and conversation. So I think hopefully during that ACEs training, at the end of it, you left some time for your school staff to really think about, you know, what's working well and what should they keep doing in terms of the practice, their SEL practices, or just the way that they're interacting and supporting students. What might they like to change? What support do they need to make these changes? What are gaps in terms of either additional professional development or curricula that they need to really be able to make this a climate much more nurturing and reflective and supportive for students and supporting SEL development. And then a commitment to meet on a regular basis to reflect on progress and discuss successes and challenges. And again, I think this is most important. A number of years ago, we had a consultant, an expert in child development and trauma, go into one of our schools, and we didn't have much of a framework, and she went in and they loved her, and they were like, oh my gosh, I totally get it, while she's there talking with them. And then they go into their classrooms, all right, the next day they got all these ideas of what they're going to do differently, and then after a couple days, they're like, wait a minute, it's not working. Or that next day they're like, wait a minute, I forgot how I was going to do this or what I was going to do. And it's like having that great math teacher, right, who teaches you math, and you're like, I totally get it. And then you get home that night to do the homework, and you're like, wait a minute, what's this, right? And you totally because she's such a good, or he's such a good instructor, right, and they get you bought into like making change or learning something new, but yet you need that ongoing coaching and support. And so I think that's where, and it doesn't need to be an expert. I think there's, like I talk about next, developing mechanisms to have this regular reflection. You can do it at staff meetings. You can do it through professional learning communities, PLCs. They can either be facilitated by an expert consultant or a consultant, or they can be staff and peer-led. I think we've got in our schools, we've got a lot of individuals that can really help lead different parts of this and help us reflect on this work, but it really needs to be ongoing reflection. I think we found at a minimum of once a month of having these conversations, so people feel safe talking about it. People feel you know, that they can listen, maybe if they're not ready to share, but they know that, oh, these are what other people are doing. Oh, that's what I was thinking about doing too. Wow, I should really try that. All of that is part of this adaptive change process. And then as you're going through those ongoing reflective conversations, having someone that's documenting interventions that are working at your school, and maybe there's a teacher who's really good at doing responsive classroom. Maybe there's someone who's really good at doing the Mind Up curriculum. You know what, let's take note of that. And so when you want to go, hey, you know what, I think I'm ready to try doing Mind Up, you know who to go to in your building. Not only is that going to help you learn how to do that better from somebody internally, but it's going to deepen your relationships and trust within the school community and staff. So next, as you're working towards those reflective conversations, now, well, what do we have in our buildings, right? Excuse me. So you've already done this period of thinking about what do we have, what do we not have in our building, but maybe now doing a more a little bit more formalized assessment of, well, you know, what are our students' needs? And I'm going to show you a slide in a minute where it talks about the 5 core competencies of social emotional learning that CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic Social Emotional Learning, talks about. But you know, what do we need? You know, where are the gaps in our tiers? What do we need? And then you can again go to CASEL, and it's a great resource to find out what are some evidence-based practices in those areas. And I'll show you a list of also some good approaches. And then I think you've also got to start with the practices that you have. Are they being used appropriately? Are they being used for what they were designed to address? And then are they being implemented with fidelity? And so here is the latest kind of castle wheel that talks about the 5 core competencies. So it's self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. And so I think really thinking about, you know, at least for me, as I'm doing work in Minneapolis and other places, I'm really kind of encouraging people, here's a real concrete framework to start from. It might not cover everything, but it really covers a lot of things where kids might have lagging skills. And so if you got a classroom or a group of students where like, wow, they're really lacking some self-awareness. This is also a place where teachers can be more reflective and staff can be more reflective about what are the problems or the misbehavior that is going on. It's not like, oh, he's just being defiant, or, you know, he's just getting in trouble all the time. Well, kind of where do you think that's coming from? And this is a way to kind of think about what are some of those areas, because I believe if a student is repeatedly getting into trouble for the similar type of behavior, just giving him a consequence does not absolve you of your duty as an adult in that school, right? If a student is continually having problems in a certain area, that really then represents a lagging skill. So we might, you know, we're going to need to give him or her a consequence for that misbehavior, but we also as adults need to take on the responsibility of recognizing, wow, okay, you really got some lagging skills and self-awareness, and you're not realizing when you're going from 0 to 8. And then when you get to 8, you're not able to be in control of your behavior anymore, and then that's when you get into these fights and other things. So here's some examples of programs and practices: Mind Up, Yoga Calm, Zones of Regulation. You've got the handout so you can kind of read through this. Things like Second Step, Responsive Classroom. I'm a huge proponent also of restorative practices. I think restorative practices really allows students to embed the message of, I can make a mistake, but I can fix it, right? And I can kind of restore those relationships and make amends. And again, positive relationships are in evidence-based practices. Having positive relationships with students, modeling them, teaching them is just so important. And then back to, again, I'm going to give you just a couple of slides here showing how Wisconsin took their 5 key trauma-informed values and talked about what does that look like in a classroom. So safety, right? So we say that we're a safe school here at Smith Elementary, and this is what safety looks in Mark's classroom. I'm going to give clear and consistent rules for managing behavior and setting limits. I'm going to create accommodations to meet individual strengths and needs. I'm going to have predictable structure, relationships, and environment. I'm going to be really mindful of reducing any bullying and harassment and make sure that we address it quickly. And I am going to use seclusion and restraint only as a very, very last resort. How do we show empowerment in our classroom, right? So we're going to show empowerment in our classroom by embedding mental health and social emotional curriculum into the curriculum by teaching coping skills, teaching self-regulation skills, providing guided opportunities for meaningful participation, by maintaining high behavioral and academic expectations, and building on strengths and really looking to build competency and competence in our students. That's how we really build empowerment in the classroom. All right, and then lastly, and I know I'm kind of, want to be mindful of time so we have enough time to discuss at the end. Self-care is so important. We need to take care of ourselves on a daily basis so that we can be our best and model our best for students, families, and colleagues, right? And so if every once in a while you're coming in, you know, at a 6 or a 7 on a scale of 0 to 10, hey, that, you know, that happens. We all have bad days. But we need to build a culture where it's okay to let each other know that, you know what, I had a really hard night last night, or I had a really hard weekend. I got some really rough news, about my parents or about something else going on in my community, and I'm really kind of struggling a little bit. I need some additional support. It's got to be safe to say that, and if you're coming in at a 6 or 7, 3 or 4 days a week, you've also got to take note of that. What's going on? What do you need to do to take care of yourself so that you're not coming in like that? Because when we come in at a 6 or 7, we don't have a lot left to give to our students, right? Because our students are coming in highly stressed, right? We know many of them are. And what we need to be able to do is be our best selves so that we can take that in for them and then show them how they can effectively cope, right? Be there to listen, be there to support. We need to recognize that self-care is not a luxury, but rather an ethical duty and an essential part of our job. We need to have building leaders that promote and actively model positive self-care and create environments where self-care is valued. And again, where school leaders are creating environments where it's safe for adults to share and reflect on beliefs and practices so we can move forward in creating more trauma-sensitive schools, right? So again, probably many of you know this, right? So impacts of secondary trauma, right? So the emotional impacts are anger, sadness, grief, guilt, depression, right? Physical, headaches, stomach aches, chronic exhaustion, sleep problems. The personal impacts, withdrawing, increased risk for substance use, pessimism, and in the workplace, avoidance, minimizing, being unmotivated, inability to empathize, and kind of disliking students and coworkers. And so what can happen, some of the negative responses, right, to coping with secondary trauma is I have a sense that I can never do enough. My to-do list is a mile long. It doesn't matter what I do. I never seem to be able to make a dent in my pile. Some deliberate kind of avoidance, like I just leave my inbox full. I don't return phone calls. Inability to empathize. I feel emotionally asleep, numb, or apathetic. Or just grandiosity, like, you know what? If I don't do this, no one will, right? No one can do it as well or the same as I do, and so I just need to do it all. These are some of our responses to secondary trauma. So what do we need to do? So again, really create, a personal resiliency plan. This is a little bit simple. We didn't have a ton of time, but I really encourage people to think about how are you going to take care of yourselves. Create a list of what creates stress in your life. What helps me stay balanced physically and emotionally? What helps me to manage my energy? What helps me to quiet my mind and calm my emotions? Who can I connect with for support or a sense of belonging? And for me, as I'm in my mid-40s now. In my 30s, I could stay up as late as I want, get my family to bed and then continue to do work. Now I just can't do that. It drains me too much the next morning, and so I need to kind of shift to going to bed a little bit earlier than I'm used to, so I can get up energized in the morning and really be able to tackle the things that I want to get done that day, so that I can feel fulfilled and feel like I'm doing a good job of supporting the students of Minneapolis and Hennepin County. And so just in closing, all of this is really about creating the systems, the supports, the consistency, right? So that schools, classrooms, and educators can promote and strengthen resiliency by having stable, nurturing, engaging environments for students. But to do that, we need to have stable, nurturing, and engaging environments for adults as well. So I think that's a lot about what I was talking about in terms of creating those systems, having a plan about how we're looking at social emotional learning. It's really creating a stable, right, predictable environment for the adults. What are we going to do? What can I do? And then all of us taking the responsibility that I have a role in the social emotional development of students. I don't have to be a social worker. I don't have to be a therapist. I can be a math teacher, and I recognize that I have a responsibility in creating a stable, nurturing, engaging environment and promoting social emotional learning. And positive, healthy relationships are really the key to creating, sustaining a resilient and healthy environment. So thank you very much, and I will hand it back to Barb.
Wow, thank you. That was all great information, and it's hard to hang on to your questions or my questions, so I'm jotting them down. So I hope others are doing that as well. Please feel free to go ahead and type any questions into the question box. We will get to them after Stacy and Sharleen. But thank you very, very much, Mark.
Absolutely.
We're going to move forward with, have to move on my screen, with Sharleen and Stacy. And girls, I'm not going to say your last name because I'm afraid that I won't say them correctly, and I didn't check with you ahead of time. But they have both introduced social emotional learning in all the Bemidji area elementary schools and surrounding areas through Peacemaker Resources. And they'll let us know a little bit more of what that is. So welcome, Stacy and Sharleen, and I'll give you the screen.
Hey Barb.
Yes.
I see that there's a hand raised. Ruth has her hand raised. She might have a question. Would now be a good time to unmute her?
So thank you, Corral. So Ruth, if you could hang on till, I know it's hard to hang on to those questions, but if you could just hang on until after Stacy and Sharleen have presented, and we will get to all questions. Thank you. Stacy and Sharleen? And you might be muted. Okay, there you go.
Can you hear me, Barb?
Yep, we can hear you now. Thank you.
All right, great. We're just working on getting the webcam started here. Oh, there we are. Hi, everyone. My name is Sharleen Zeman-Sperle, and I am joined with my colleague, Stacy Bender-Fayette. I don't know if you can see her. There she is. And thanks for the introduction. Stacy and I are both educators up here in Bemidji, Minnesota, and we work for an organization called Peacemaker Resources. Peacemaker Resources is a nonprofit located in the Bemidji area, but we do work all over Northwest Minnesota. Schools contract with us to provide social and emotional learning instruction in their schools, as well as doing some professional development with their teachers in those schools. Our flagship program is called the STAR program, and that stands for Students Teaching Attitudes of Respect, and that's done in collaboration with the Northwest Minnesota Foundation. And what happens with STAR is in these schools in Northwest Minnesota, they choose a team of sixth or seventh graders and an advisor. Those teams come to a 2-day social and emotional learning camp. They come to STAR camp, and they learn social and emotional learning skills. Then what they do is they take those skills back to their school and they present to their peers and their school community. So they essentially are teachers of social and emotional learning. And they do that through a curriculum that Peacemaker Resources wrote called Speak Your Peace. And in that Speak Your Peace curriculum, there are lessons about conflict resolution, feelings and needs, and there's presentations and activities for those students then to teach their peers. And then we also do some cultural responsiveness, which includes starting the truth and reconciliation process in the Bemidji area. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Northwest Minnesota because I think it's extremely different from the work that Mark is doing in the Minneapolis area. In fact, he said, you know, he had written on his slides that it was large urban schools, and I had written down exactly the opposite, small rural schools. And, you know, Bemidji in Northwest Minnesota is the largest community, and that's 14,000 people. So most of the schools that we're working in are in communities of less than 1,000 people. There, 3 of the poorest counties in Minnesota are here in Northwest Minnesota. The schools are spread apart. Most of the schools are K-12 schools. And again, there's lots of pros and cons to this. It's kind of a double-edged sword. And I'm saying this because sometimes in these schools, change can happen a lot faster than they can happen in, say, Minneapolis Public Schools, where you're talking about 50,000 students instead of 200 students in a school. And where the teachers are the committees, and they are the ones who are really the drivers behind social emotional learning and trauma-sensitive schools. And it also means that the principal might also be the superintendent, and the principal at the elementary level is also the principal at the high school and is also the superintendent. So change can happen a lot faster in those areas. But it also means that because these schools are so rural, there may not be a social worker, they may not be a mental health provider. They might have access to this once every 3 weeks, but there isn't necessarily someone in the school providing those services. So when there is a crisis, it can be challenging for those students to have the support that they need. So that's a little bit about Northwest Minnesota. So, you know, why have a trauma-sensitive school? And we know that the problem is that many of these little people coming into our buildings have high ACEs, and we know that those ACEs can impact learning and behavior and the relationships at school. And so Peacemaker Resources really strives to help these schools become more trauma sensitive and having those children feel safe at school. And we know that this is a whole school effort, and we want it to be a major focus of educational reform. And so the way that this looks for Peacemaker Resources and the work that we do is really trauma sensitive school is the large umbrella over the top. And then really we find that the foundation is that ACE training and awareness. The awareness piece is really key into why do we want to have a trauma sensitive school? Why do we want to make these changes? And really it's child-centered. The families, we really think it's important for the families to also have some of this ACE training and awareness. And we also want them to have those self-regulation strategies to use at home with their children. And this is an area that I think in the next year we're really wanting to strengthen. And the reason is because we are hearing from teachers that we work with that families are coming to them, or parents are coming to them and saying, my children are bringing this information home. How can I learn more? And so because really the parents are asking for more, we're realizing we need to do more. And so that really is going to be our focus, I think, in the next year. But when we look over at what schools are doing, at Peacemaker Resources, we focus on the students, but we really are focusing on the teachers. I was a primary education teacher when I fell into being a social and emotional learning specialist, and I realized when I started doing social and emotional learning that it was really hard to teach social and emotional learning. Part of it was I didn't feel like I was that great at social and emotional learning. I felt like I had a lot of skills that I needed to learn, and so we hear from teachers that it can feel really uncomfortable if you've never taught social and emotional learning to teach social and emotional learning. And so we spend a lot of our efforts focusing on the teachers and making sure that they're providing safe classrooms for those students. And we do that by SEL lesson modeling, which Stacy will get into a little bit here as we go through. And then we also do some consultation with those school staff. So, you know, I said we focused on the teachers, and so here's some of the professional development that we do. Like I said, we do ACEs for educators, and that's really the foundation. And we have kind of shifted that title from ACEs for educators to calling it an introduction to trauma-sensitive schools, because we really wanted to give them some strategies that teachers can implement right away. We realize that teachers, if they're giving up 3 hours of their time, that they really want to have some tools that they can take back into their classroom and do tomorrow. And so we really want to make sure that we give them a couple of things that they can try right away because they're very enthusiastic and they have an audience to practice on. And I know some of this, Mark has already stated, and so we're just reiterating it and providing why it's so important. And I know Mark too mentioned the importance of professional learning communities. So the idea that professional development is ongoing and there's an opportunity to practice and learn from one another. And then we've also done some SEL curriculum specific workshops around Second Step and Mind Up. And then again, social and emotional learning lessons and integration of SEL throughout the school day. This is sort of my soapbox. Social and emotional learning, I think, is the specific teaching of skills. And if you teach those skills, then you can integrate it throughout the whole day, and it becomes really a way of life in the classroom with the social and emotional learning skills. And if you're not teaching those skills, then you don't have anything to practice. And you want those students to be able to practice those skills throughout the day. And not just in the classroom, but this, I guess, goes to why it's so important to have a school-wide program, because then they're doing it on the playground and in the lunchroom and in the music room, and it just becomes a common language for the school. So we've done trauma-sensitive schools workshops in many schools, and we've done it to almost 1,000 people, which we feel really proud about in the last 2 years. And I think it's important to note that a lot of these schools, it's not just the teachers or it's not just the special ed teachers, but it's the whole staff. It's the bus drivers and the cafeteria workers and the front office staff. They're all coming together to realize how toxic stress is impacting these people that are coming through our doors every day, and what are the ways that we can work with them in a way that's more compassionately. So these are the objectives that we use for our Introduction to Trauma-Sensitive Schools workshop. We briefly overview the Adverse Childhood Experience study. We learn the impacts of trauma on the brain and the implications that has in the classroom. We discuss some specific trauma-sensitive practices and procedures. And then we also give the staff time to explore next steps for your school to effectively respond to students exposed to trauma. And again, because it's Northwest Minnesota and because these schools are quite small, it really is easy for them to make changes right away. And we have seen, where did my questions go? There they are. Let's have them on there. Okay, so these are our 3 questions that we ask at the end of that workshop, and I think Mark had also mentioned some of these. We have teachers really think about what trauma-sensitive practices that their school is already implementing. What are they already doing, and what are the ways that we can be more intentional about those things? What practices would your school like to strengthen or add? So again, thinking about the activities that they're doing that they really want to be more intentional about. And then what practices does your school need to reevaluate? And I think they might possibly be doing things that aren't trauma sensitive that they would like to change. And so this is an opportunity for them to discuss those practices. And again, this is an opportunity for teachers to make those changes right away in their schools because the schools are so small and because they have the power to do that. And just I can give 2 examples of what we saw that happened right away in a school is just a little thing where we were at a middle school, high school. It was a 6-12 school. One teacher was saying, I have this student that drives me crazy, and every day he comes in and says, what are we doing? What are we doing? What are we doing? What are we doing? And she was realizing why that child was doing that, why that student was doing that, and then realized, oh, I could just write an agenda on the board and explain exactly what we're doing. And so that is just one trauma-sensitive tool that teacher is now implementing in her classroom to make a child feel more safe and to have that predictability for that student. And I think we realize that, kindergarten teachers do that, but I think sometimes when you get up into 6th, 7th, 8th grade, you think that students don't need that as well, or as much as the younger people, but we're discovering that those procedures and those practices and the consistency and the predictability is extremely important at all ages. And another thing, we were at another 6-12 school, and right away the school just, you know, at that trauma-sensitive school workshops decided to make some changes, and they decided to implement a social and emotional learning curriculum during their homeroom hour. And so it was just a way for them to, and so they're in the process and consulting with us on finding the right curriculum for them, and they think they might just write their own because they're so gung-ho about it, that, but that's just ways that schools are making that move towards being more trauma sensitive, and how really it's the teachers that are leading that way. And the great thing is that administrators are really starting to listen to what the teachers are saying, and they're saying, we need more help, we want to implement social emotional learning, we need more professional development on this. And the good thing is that the administrators are listening and providing that for those teachers. So here, the professional learning community, the PLCs that we've led, have given us an opportunity to really revisit the information from the ACEs, or Trauma Sensitive Schools workshop. And I think that's really important, because when you hear it one time and you're taking in so much information, sometimes you're missing a lot of information. And so once teachers have given the opportunity to practice and implement strategies, I think the information makes more sense if you go back and revisit it. So that was really important for us. We talked specifically about some trauma-informed strategies, and I listed some sources there that you can find online. Just do some free PDFs. One is called The Heart of Learning and Teaching, and Mark referred to that as well. And the other one is called Helping Traumatized Children Learn. And that really actually is more of a framework for a school, but it does give some classroom strategies for teachers to try. And again, this is an opportunity for teachers to ask questions, and then, you know, get some strategies, go back to their classroom to try it out, come back to the group, share their successes and failures, and then think about what's another way that we can do it again. And then they also visited each other's classroom and took a look at what are the things, you know, how is the classroom set up that might be more trauma sensitive than other ways. And there's things like turning down lights and having more natural light, and one teacher had everything off the walls, just so it was a real clean space, and just getting feedback and letting other teachers see what that looks like. I think we don't always have the opportunity, teachers for sure don't always have the opportunity to visit other teachers and to see what they're doing in their classrooms. And I think that they learn a lot from one another. And so it's just giving them that opportunity to do that. And then SEL curriculum specific workshops, and that's just ongoing support of the curriculum implementation that a school district has selected, that we went in to make sure that they were evaluating and going through the process of implementing that curriculum. And now I'm going to turn it over to Stacy, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the implementation of social emotional learning into the classroom and the way that we're considering it teacher professional development.
Thank you. I am just checking our webcam here to see if we are set up, so I'm not cutting off our...
Oh, I might have.
I hope that you could see Sharleen during her presentation. So let's go back here, and I'll try not to move around too much. I have to be honest, this is our first webinar, so we're practicing and testing, and any feedback would be helpful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we're doing and our journey over the last year and a half. My background, I'm a elementary education and special ed teacher who's been working for 20 years in schools, but I've only been working as a social emotional learning specialist for the last 2 years. And our journey actually started with me attending a presentation by Mark Sander in Minneapolis, actually, and that was my first introduction to ACEs 2 years ago. And from there, our work has just been growing and growing. And I think, you know, our organization has been around. Peacemaker Resources has been around for almost 20 years. And the interesting thing is we've been teaching social emotional learning, but now people are really listening because there's the science, the brain research, and all of the work around being trauma-informed that is really changing our job and the way people are approaching social emotional learning in schools. So that's good news. We had the opportunity to be part of a public health grant, and it was an Accountable Communities for Health grant. And they came to Peacemaker Resources because we already had relationships in schools. And what they asked of us is to create pilot projects that we could share like we are doing today. So we chose Paul Bunyan Elementary School in Bemidji, and actually that is a kindergarten building. There's 240 kindergartners in that building. And the reason that we went with that school, not only we believe that self-regulation and social emotional learning can start at that age, and it's important to start at that age, but also that school administrator was very interested in having us come in, and we knew that she would be our support. So what our pilot project looked like is, and we have continued actually into our second year now, is I go into the classrooms every other week. So I spend a half hour, 30 minutes in each of the kindergarten classrooms, and I model a social emotional learning lesson. And I'll tell you more about that in just a minute. We are designing this as being professional development. It is for the students, but it's really for the teachers. So our modeling of social emotional learning classes is professional development, which is job embedded for each of those teachers who sits in on the lesson and participates. Another part of that pilot project, which we're excited about, is the collaboration with Stellar Human Services. So this Stellar Human Services brought over a trauma coach who is a therapist that would just sit in once a week in classrooms, observe students, observe teaching, and then he wasn't actually meeting with the students one-on-one. He would later meet with the teachers and give them feedback. So he might say, I noticed that this child behaved this way at the certain point. That might be a trigger that we want to watch. Or, you know, I noticed this student really struggling, and here's a strategy that I've used that might be helpful in this situation. So that was the trauma coach portion of the project. So I know Mark already shared the castle wheel, and this is what we base our social emotional learning instruction on as well. And our trauma-sensitive schools work is really focused on the areas of self-awareness and self-management. And we know that in kindergarten classrooms, it's all about self-awareness and self-regulation and self-management. So a lot of our lessons are around that particular topic. And it's interesting, so as we started modeling these social emotional learning lessons in classrooms, and I told you that the teachers are participating in those, it's interesting when we first started, some of the teachers were a little skeptical, which I don't know why I was surprised, and I don't know why I was surprised, but I was told in particular there was a teacher that was skeptical about giving up a half hour of instructional time. And we know that teachers there's a lot of pressure for teachers in the area of academics. So she was worried about giving up that half hour. And it's interesting as we start working with social emotional learning lessons and she's seeing what we're doing with the students, I can tell you that she was the teacher 2 weeks into our pilot project. She chased me down in the hall and said, where can I get a chime? So the chime was one of the tools that I was using in breath work with the students as a cue for the students to take a deep breath and to calm. And so slowly we were starting to see the buy-in. And that was really our whole idea with that project of modeling the social emotional learning lessons. Because in the past, these teachers had been given social emotional learning curriculum, but they weren't using it. So they had the second step box maybe on the shelf and it wasn't being used. So our approach was we wanted to go into the schools and we really wanted to model what this looks like because we know not all teachers are comfortable teaching social emotional learning. And the example that we often give is for myself, for example, I would not be comfortable teaching high school math without the proper training and without the language. So I would have to practice that, and that's the approach that we're taking, is the teachers are watching us model the language and the practice of social emotional learning, so it's building their confidence in teaching it as well. We did we've been looking at this report on and off over the last year and a half, and it's from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and it talks specifically about self-regulation. And in our trauma-sensitive schools work, we talk a lot about giving students the tools for self-regulation. And what we found interesting in this report is it really specifically talks about those periods that are important. And those periods being that early childhood, so the kindergarten center where we are, and early adolescence, which in the case of our work is our STAR, Students Teaching Attitudes of Respect program. So we're really focusing in on those particular age groups. Someone posed it to me once, and I think that this really makes sense, but they were talking to a room full of teachers, and they said, you know, teachers, if you were a second grade teacher and a new student came to your classroom and that particular student didn't know how to read, what would you do? And so she let the teachers ponder that question, and you know, the response is you would create a plan to teach the student how to read, and maybe you'd reach out to the title teacher and you'd create a plan. First we're going to start here, and then we're going to move to this skill until the child can read. But what if that new student in your classroom knew how to read, but they didn't have any self-regulation skills? What do you do? If they don't have self-regulation skills, oftentimes those students are then sent to the office for behavior issues. And so our challenge to teachers in our trauma-sensitive schools workshops is teachers, use your skills. Let's be curious about those behaviors. Let's try to figure out how we can create a plan to teach self-regulation. First, we're going to start with breath work. Then we're going to move to this. So rather than passing the student on to the office to try to solve this problem, we're challenging teachers to figure out this is part of creating these human beings and this whole child, and that it should be part of the classroom instruction. So where do we start at the kindergarten center? We start with teaching them to be brain scientists, and that is true. That's what we do. So we really enjoy the Mind Up curriculum, and the image that you're seeing here is a poster of the brain that's part of that curriculum. And this is how I start with kindergartners. I, you know, excite them about being brain scientists, and we bring in the little doctor coat with the stethoscope, and I tell them that I'm going to teach them the doctor words for the brain. So we start with the amygdala, and that's your guard dog. That's fight, flight, or freeze. So we start with the amygdala, and we kind of introduce it with feelings. So we talk about feelings that are comfortable, and we talk about feelings that are uncomfortable. So when you have feelings that are comfortable, such as happiness or being calm, you're able to access the thinking part of your brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, or the wise owl. So we start introducing this concept, and then we introduce, but what about those feelings when we're not feeling safe, when we're feeling worried or angry, and we feel those in our amygdala. And when our amygdala is feeling uncomfortable, we're not able to access the thinking part of our brain. So that's when we start preparing them for some of that breath work. So one tool that we use that kindergartners can really relate to is we use Dan Siegel's brain hand model. So the amygdala being that guard dog, the prefrontal cortex, folding your fingers over, the prefrontal cortex is your wise owl, the thinking part of your brain. And when you're having comfortable feelings, you're in the thinking part of the brain. And I've noticed that some teachers are now using this as a symbol with their students, pointing out the thinking part of their brain. But when your amygdala is feeling uncomfortable, you're feeling worried, or you're feeling stressed, you may flip your lid. And how do we access our thinking part of our brain again? By doing some breathing and breath work. So that's where the self-regulation skills come in. So we start each of our social emotional learning lessons with some breath work, calming our amygdalas. And I realize I'm on a webcam, so I could show some of these. The belly breath, we're often using the breathing ball, which you've probably seen some of those. But also the 5-finger breathing, if you're not familiar, that's basically just tracing your hand. So we have the kids hold up their hand, they're breathing in as they move up, holding at the top and exhaling as they go down. Breathing in, exhaling as they go down. So each of these tools We asked the kids after doing the breath work to notice how their body is feeling, to talk about their brain, and that this would be one of the tools in their toolkit. So we've been really kind of building this toolkit idea. I just have them fold their hands like this, and at the beginning of our lesson each week I say, okay, boys and girls, open up your toolkit. This is your toolkit for being calm. This is your toolkit for having self-control. Let's dig through our toolkit and find the breathing technique that's going to work best for us today. Kind of acknowledging that each of us, once we've introduced these, each of us may be able to calm in a different way. So another practice that we've been integrating is Yoga Calm. So I had the opportunity to go through the Yoga Calm program, which I highly recommend, and there's wonderful trainers in the Minneapolis area, Kathy Flaminio, who I just admire her work and the work that she's doing in the metro area with Yoga Calm, and we're happy to bring that to rural Bemidji and northwest Minnesota as well. So using some of that movement, that mind-body connection to help kids also find calm. A funny story that I'd like to share. I was at Target one day and I noticed one of the kindergartners there, and she's waving at me, and I wave back and I say hello, and she and her mother pushes her cart kind of moving away from me, and I hear her mother say to the kindergartner, "Who is that?" And the kindergartner's response was, "Oh, that's my breathing teacher." I was like, right on, that's right, I'm a breathing teacher, and I'm proud of that. I also had the opportunity to observe students. You know, the whole goal in this is that they'll be able to use these tools when they need to, right, on their own without teacher prompting. And I'll be honest with you, last week I was in the kindergarten classrooms and I had a cooperative learning activity which failed horribly. The kindergartners in each of their little groups, I could hear them arguing, having a hard time deciding who was going to lead the activity, and I could quickly see that this was not working. But I just sat back and I was curious and observing what would happen. And I noticed one little boy in a group that was particularly difficult. And he said, "Hey, you know what, guys? I think this would be a good time for us to put on the brakes." And putting on the brakes is one of those calming tools. And I watched this group of 5 kids together capture their energy, take a deep breath, talk to their brain, talk to their body. And I was just, I was overwhelmed actually seeing that they were using the tools appropriately at appropriate times. I can also tell you that a friend of mine that has a kindergartner at the kindergarten center sent me a video of her child in full flip your lid mode, and her daughter is explaining on the video, "Mom, I just flipped my lid. I need to take some calm breaths to get back to the thinking part of my brain." So I know that this is they're bringing it home, that the ripple effect is happening. It's moving beyond the school. And I just think, and I say this to kindergartners and teachers all the time, is if we can teach these skills in kindergarten, if we can teach self-regulation and the self-awareness in kindergarten, just think the learning that can happen from there. It's really exciting to see that transformation. Throughout all of our work, we're really stressing the importance of positive relationships, and that's what teaching is all about, right? That's why we became teachers, is so we can have those positive relationships with students. So we're asking schools and staff to really be intentional about their work with students. You know, in some of the smaller schools, we've ended our trauma-sensitive schools workshops with note cards that have the name of every student in the school building, and we pass around that pile of note cards until everyone has a small pile in their hand, with the challenge that you as teachers please try to connect with each of those students so they each have adults in their life and in the school building that they can turn to. So really being intentional about that. And I think part of it, you know, we tell teachers all the time in our trauma-sensitive schools work is, you know, it's not your job, teachers, to figure out who has ACEs and who doesn't have ACEs. What if we just assumed that everyone does? And that's a practice that you could have in your life as well. What if we just assumed that everyone around us has ACEs, because most of us do? And what if we were just more compassionate? What if we were more compassionate with our students? What if we were more compassionate to our colleagues? What if we were more compassionate to our families? I think it's a whole movement. And there was a touching story that I'd like to share. And kind of the background of that is in Bemidji schools, Mark came and started this process with us, which we really appreciate. So a year and a half ago, Mark came and trained 300 Bemidji teachers and about ACEs. And from there, Peacemaker Resources, we offered a professional learning community for any of the teachers that were interested in that follow-up and learning more. So in that professional learning community, we really talked specifically about strategies in the classroom, and that's where we made the classroom visits like Sharleen suggested. And it was interesting because just a couple weeks ago, that same group of teachers, they're on their second year, and once a month they are meeting during their professional learning communities, and they're learning from each other, and they're sharing successes, and they're sharing failures. But they invited me to come back, and they said, you know, Stacy, we would like to revisit the ACE study and the neuroscience around that. And I was like, great, you've heard it again before from Mark, but yeah, let's share it again. So during that session, we went over the ACE work again a year and a half later, and I watched this room of teachers with their mouths gaping open as we went through the information. And it wasn't because of the way I was presenting it, it was because now they were making all of these connections. So like Mark said earlier, it's not a once and you're done kind of deal. This is a process that we all need to commit to, learning more, and we're all learning. Sharleen and I participate in ACE workshops often as both presenters and attendees, and we always learn something new because we're ready for it. And maybe there's a particular child or a particular person that we're thinking about. So in this case, what happened was this teacher in the session that's been looking at it for a year and a half, she's a veteran kindergarten teacher who I would say was is a more traditional teacher and has a more traditional approach. She said, I'd really like to share a story with you. And the story that she wanted to share is she said, today I walked my kids out to the bus and I put all the kids on the bus and I noticed one of the students was missing. And she said, I was angry. You know, I got all the kids on the bus and I'm angry. Why isn't that one particular kid in line? They weren't following directions. And she said, as I walked back to my classroom, I was thinking to myself, you know, that child had a particularly hard day today. It was unusual. And she said she walked in her classroom and that kid was by their cubby with a runny nose and red eyes. And she said in the past she would have laid into that kid and said, why aren't you following directions? Get out to the bus. It's time to go. But she said, I made a different choice. I knelt down with that child and I looked at her and I said, what is going on with you? And the child shared some, you know, challenges that she's having at home. And this veteran teacher said, I am so glad that I made the right choice. And I didn't lay into her, I just listened. And I was compassionate. So for me, of course, I had tears in my eyes at that moment. That's just one teacher, but that's what we're talking about, is that small change. I see that my tie needed talk more quickly, so I'll do that so we have time for questions. I just want to note, if you haven't seen Paper Tigers, this is one of the resources that we talk to teachers. This is a school that completely transformed, and that transformation was led by their school administrator, and this is the documentary, which is available on Amazon Video, I noticed as well. What are the results of Paul Bunyan Elementary? I can tell you that that administrator is really who made this happen. Kathy Van Wert comes in as the principal, observes my social emotional learning lessons so that she can use the same language on her morning announcements, which is pretty amazing. We are hearing from parents that it is also, they're hearing about it at home. Our goal next year is really to meet the needs of parents. So we're going to do parent nights. We're also talking about creating videos based on the social emotional learning lessons that we're teaching, so the students or the parents can use the language that the students are at home. The good news is behavioral referrals were cut in half at this elementary school, and you ask the teachers why that is, and they will tell you because the self-regulation is happening in the classroom. And I really need to applaud Bemidji area schools because they are making some amazing changes in their school district in the area of being trauma informed. They have trained their teachers in responsive classroom, so that's the whole school culture and climate approach. They have added Second Step, and not only have they added Second Step as a social emotional learning curriculum throughout the buildings, but they're also providing workshops for teachers. So Sharleen and I are going in once a month, and we're doing workshops on Second Step to keep them interested and motivated in that area. So we're excited about our work and what's happening, but I need to leave time for questions. So, teacher self-care, I think Mark really hit this well. If we don't take care of ourselves, we can't take care of our students, and that's the reality. So let's move on to questions, and I'm going to let Barb take over.
Wow, thank you so much. It's so exciting for me to hear what the 5- and 6-year-olds are doing. I actually have 2 6-year-olds, and in one of their first grade classes, they're doing the yoga. And when she first started telling me, I was, what are you doing? So she had to explain, but it's that was pretty exciting to hear. We are going to, so we have several questions up in the question box, but actually if you could put your screens back up, your video cam back up, and I think that would help with the conversation if you're willing to do that, so we can see you again. We're going to go ahead and open it up if you want to ask a question, if you want to share. What have you tried? What would you like to try? What are you doing? Or any other questions that you have for Mark, Stacy, or Sharleen. Okay. There was a couple. I'm going to go to, and in between time, I will read some of the questions. Just go ahead and click on the hand and put your hand up, and I will unmute you at that time. All right. Denise, I am trying to unmute you. I think you're muted on your end. And now you put your hand down. That's okay. That's all right. So in the meantime, the handouts, I've been asked about the slides. The slides are included in the webinar. If you are not able to find them, we will make sure that you get them. But there's slides are part of the handouts connected to this webinar. Question, do you have parent handouts that you use as a resource for the self-regulation skill development? Can you share those? And I'm not sure who that question is, so either any of you.
Well, this is Stacy. I can tell you this is, like I mentioned, an area that we really need to strengthen in our own work is bringing that message to parents. Right now, what's happening is the classroom teachers are including the directions for self-regulation strategies in their weekly newsletters. So parents are seeing it there. But next year, we are hoping to have videos on our website, peacemakerresources.org, if you want to check back there, that will have some of those self-regulation tools so that parents can be learning them as well. I know that if you do a Google search for the Dan Siegel brain hand model, you'll find a PDF out there online that describes the brain and the hand approach that we shared.
Mm-hmm.
And there are also, just searching online, like the 5-finger breathing that Stacy showed, there's a nice PDF out there on that as well.
Comment, this is fantastic. Thank you, from Nicole. Is there a form used by the trauma coach to help guide the direction for the teachers?
I can't answer that actually, but I can check into that. So if you whoever's asking that question, I would love to put you in touch with a trauma coach that worked at the kindergarten center. His name is Chris Godding. He works for Stellar Human Services, and I would be happy to pass that question on to him, and you could start a dialogue.
Okay, can you get the slides? Yep, they're already attached.
So for me,
Okay.
just as you're looking for some more questions, I'll just say that, you know, I did some classroom observations myself in some schools in St. Paul, and you know, one of the things that struck me was a lot of teachers were doing really, really great work, and as I spoke with them after doing just like a 10-minute kind of observation, was the significant amount of self-doubt. I think that, you know, they were thinking that the work that they would do would have an impact more quickly than it was, and so a lot of what I just told them was, wow, you know, you're doing a great job, and for some of these teachers, getting that positive feedback related to how they're interacting with their students was something they just didn't experience a whole lot, and I would say that 70–80% of the teachers that I talked to started crying, and it was some of them talking about, wow, you know, I just, it's so good to hear that, you know, I worry that I'm not doing the right thing. So I think a lot of it is just reinforcing some of the really good things that teachers are doing and help them to do it more with more confidence, to do it more regularly, those kind of things. So just wanted to throw that in.
Yep,
No, just
thank
with
you.
students, when they're learning a new skill, you want them to practice it. It's the same thing with teachers. The more you do it, the more confident you're going to be. So just try to get over that hump a little bit and push your comfort zone out a little bit. And I think that, you know, teachers already have that skill. Like Mark said, it's just a matter of doing it with confidence and believing in themselves. Because I know that they're already doing great work. It's just, can they do it a little bit more intentionally?
And then I think people recognizing it. I think other staff and administrators really recognizing that work and not always just focusing on the academic instruction, but also focusing on, wow, you're doing such a great job of modeling, you know, self-awareness or whatever, to help that teacher know that that's being recognized as well.
So Denise doesn't have audio, but she wrote her question in. I'm a school nurse in Delaware. A classroom teacher and I are starting a wellness committee for both staff and students next school year. What have you seen other school nurses doing in regards to these topics?
Wow, you know, I think just really being, you know, taking some of those leadership roles like you are. I think the other thing is, you know, school nurses are the ones that are seeing all of the internalizing students, right, that might not be on other people's radar, you know, and especially in middle and high schools where the same teacher isn't seeing the same student most of the day, every day. They don't know, like, wow, you know, Susie's gone down to the nurse's office, you know, 5 times this week, but it's been during 5 different teachers' classrooms, so it's not really on anybody's radar. So I think that that's a place for the students that are, you know, kind of suffering in silence, those externalizers. That's a great role for the school nurses and the school health office to really bring that information forward to your school-wide teams that are thinking about students and students who maybe need additional support, either in the classroom or, you know, from, you know, a tier 2 kind of service. So.
Mm-hmm.
I think another great way that the school nurse can help is, and then we saw Kathy Van Wert, who is the administrator at the kindergarten center that we talked about. She had Stacy come in and do that self-care workshop, and I think if that nurse can do any kind of teacher self-care and promote that positive psychology and practice some mindfulness skills, I think any of those things really help a teacher out as well.
And I was also thinking about the Paper Tigers documentary. The school nurse really has a critical role in the transformation of that school. In fact, they started a clinic, a health clinic at the high school. So I think watching Paper Tigers might give you some ideas, and it would be fun to do that as the committee to start your work on how a school can really transform. Is pretty amazing.
This is from Nicole. I want to show this webinar to other teachers. Will it be available after first hearing? Thank you for asking that question. And yes, we are recording this and it will be available, and I'm not exactly sure how, but it will be available on our website, pcamn.org, and also as a follow-up email, I think after this webinar you will be able to get it through there. So thank you for asking that question. Does anyone know of a good resource for TIC or SEL curriculum to implement for high school students?
Oof, yeah, that is tough. I think that you know, I can certainly talk with the SEL experts here at the Minneapolis Public Schools about high school resources. I know that it's a little bit more challenging, but I think that there are some things out there. So if you want to send me an email, and you can get it either through Barb or my email is mark.sander, S-A-N-D-E-R, at Hennepin, HENNEPIN.US. I can certainly get you connected with folks that might know about that.
We often hear this question recently, quite a bit actually. And you know, our resource for SEL curriculum, we always go to CASEL first, and CASEL.org, where they take a look at all of the SEL curriculum and kind of rate it. We don't have a lot of experience with high school curriculum. I would name some of them, but I'm not accessing my prefrontal cortex.
I know one of them is Botvan Life Skills, which I think is sold as a drug and alcohol prevention, but I think there is a lot of social and emotional learning strategies and skills kind of embedded in through that. I haven't used it myself, but we are doing some research on it, so that's about all.
Yeah, and I encourage you to check back with us because we might know more soon.
And I know that there's a 6-8 curriculum that's through the University of Minnesota. Mark, do you know what that is called? Off the top of your head? I can't think of it.
I don't know, but I do believe that they were working on a Mind Up version for high schools. So the Mind Up curriculum that's now that Scholastic owns, I believe that they're working on a high school curriculum, but I don't know the U of M one.
So Dorothy is sharing, Michigan Model for Health Curriculum has a high school level social emotional lessons. It's on CASEL. CASEL is CASEL.org.
Thank you.
I know we've gone over just a little bit, but this is great information, and we probably should have made it for 2 hours to leave room because there's so much. Couple things that were talked about, the Mind Up curriculum, Yoga Calm, and zones of regulations. Where can we find more information on this to get that curriculum? Those, or see where they are.
I would say probably just, I bet if you Googled all of those, you would get the information.
The great thing about Mind Up and Zones of Regulation is they're both affordable curriculums that you can purchase off Amazon for under 20 bucks.
Oh, that is a nice price. Good, because a lot of curriculums are pretty expensive. That's nice. Thank you.
And Barb, I have a request.
Yes.
I'm wondering, I do have a recording of the kindergarten principal in her morning announcements. Would it be okay if I played that? It's just a 1-minute audio clip.
Yes, I'm giving. Do you have the screen? You must have the screen.
I do.
Okay, yes, please.
So as we mentioned, the kindergarten center observes the social emotional learning lesson, and then she's integrating that. And the reason that I want to share this is it doesn't cost any money for a school to start using consistent language, and this is how they're doing it at the kindergarten center.
Boys and girls, let's prepare our brains for learning today. We'll take 3 deep breaths to warm up our prefrontal cortex. Ready? Breathe in and out. Breathe in and out. Breathe in and out. Thank you, boys and girls. Always remember, breathing helps us in so many ways. Make it a wonderful day, boys and girls. Be kind, because nice matters.
So that's just a simple example of how a school can start making change. And I think within your classroom, you can make changes, but if you want to see school change as a whole culture, it really takes an administrator that is willing to take that step.
Right, and thanks for sharing that. I think, for me, that's why I kind of talked about, some of the systems pieces of this, because, as I've talked to folks across the state, they're bringing in, oh, we really want to do Mind Up, or we really want to do Yoga Calm, or we really want to do this mindfulness practice, which is awesome. I really want to encourage that, but that practice alone will not get you to be trauma informed. And so that's why I kind of took the lead as the first presenter, talking about this more kind of system, kind of whole school, whole district kind of approach to thinking about, how are you going to have these systems so that when you bring in these different practices, you have a way to organize them, and you can start slow, but at first have this bigger framework that you've thought about. You don't have to do it all at once, but have this like, okay, this is our goal in 3 or 4 or 5 years. We want to get to having this all filled out. But now that we know that we've got this framework, let's start adding the pieces in. And again, we can't emphasize enough the importance of kind of school leaders really taking that, every moment they have to, during morning announcements, while they're in the lunchroom, while they're in classrooms, really modeling it for students and teachers. So great audio to share.
I'm sorry, I was trying to get in your contact information in the chat box so everyone can have that. So if you give me a couple more seconds, I will have everyone's in there. And I'm not seeing any more questions right now. This has actually been wonderful, and I know we've gone over a couple minutes, but thank you all very, very much for staying with us, and thank you, Mark, thank you, Stacy, thank you, Sharleen. This is great. Any last comments?
I'd like to take a minute to thank Mark, because Mark really helped us in our journey. He built our foundation of understanding ACEs, and so we thank you from rural Minnesota, Mark.
And I'm not sorry to interrupt, Mark, but to thank MCCC too for hosting this webinar, but also for doing the ACE interface training that I think so many Minnesotans have been able to take a part of, the ACE training and the ACE awareness, which really is the foundation of the work we do. So we really appreciate that.
Well, hey, and Stacy and Sharleen and Peacemaker Resources, I'm so impressed with what you guys have done, a year and a half later. It's really amazing, and I also want to thank, MCCC for having this webinar, but also, getting me trained, about, now, 4 years ago in this. It's really, changed my career and my life, and I really appreciate it. So thanks for the opportunities.
And I was able to put all three, I didn't include phone numbers, but I did put your emails in there so people can have those, so you should be able to see them in the chat box, and you're very welcome. We are thrilled that you are able to present with us today. With that, I think we will wrap it up. Thank you very, very much. Everyone have a safe week, and please fill out the evaluations. You'll get a reminder about the evaluation coming to your email soon, and this will be recorded. You should be able to find that also on our website. Mark, did you have anything else?
Well, I would just say I think at the end of both of our PDFs of our talk is our contact information as well.
Good.
So if you don't get it in the chat box, or you're not able to save it, it'll be in the PDFs that'll come out.
Great.
So thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you very much. I didn't look at that. All right. Thank you.